Recently, Republican senators took an unusual and serious step by voting against their own president. This was not an action taken by Democrats or independents, but by members of the Republican Party themselves. When Donald Trump became aware of this vote, reports say he called Senator Susan Collins and launched into an angry, profanity-filled outburst that shocked even long-serving lawmakers. I have covered Washington for many years. I have witnessed party infighting and deep political disagreements. However, this situation is different. This involves the president's own party actively working to limit his authority. He is seeking to use emergency powers, war powers, and executive authorities that have the ability to reshape global events in a very short period of time. At the same time, Trump is declaring a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets, hinting at possible military action against allied territory, and allowing his promised transparency initiative to slow down, triggering formal oversight requests. This is not political drama or entertainment. This is a real-time test of how American democracy functions under pressure. By the end of this breakdown, you will understand what is truly at stake, not only for this presidency, but for every presidency that follows. Let us begin. This is the full story, because headlines alone do not show the complete picture. Over the past several days, a series of developments in Washington has produced something rarely seen, an internal rebellion within a sitting president's own party. It began with the War Powers Resolution. For background, the War Powers Act, passed in 1973, was created to limit presidential control over military action. It requires the president to consult with Congress before committing United States forces to combat and places time limits on how long troops can remain deployed without congressional approval. This law is one of the most important safeguards in the constitutional system. Last week, that safeguard was activated not only by Democrats, but also with meaningful Republican support. The resolution would limit the president's ability to take military action on his own, and enough Republicans voted with Democrats to move it forward. The question is why they would take such a step. The answer lies in recent statements coming from the White House that have unsettled even some of the president's strongest supporters. The president has publicly discussed the idea of using military force to acquire Greenland. Take a moment to consider that statement. Greenland is not unclaimed land. It is not a disputed territory. It is part of Denmark, a NATO ally, and a country that the United States is legally obligated to help defend under existing treaties. Despite this, the president suggested military action against it. Senator Chris Murphy recently explained the implications clearly. Any military action against Greenland could potentially trigger a conflict involving the entire NATO alliance. Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, could be invoked. That would mean the United States attacking an ally. Republican and Democratic lawmakers alike heard this and concluded that a boundary had to be established. As a result, they voted. When Trump realized that members of his own party had opposed him on an issue this serious, his response was not calm discussion or persuasion. Instead, it was anger. According to reports, the call to Senator Collins involved shouting, profanity, and threats. That response reveals how this president views disagreement. Rather than seeing dissent as part of a functioning democracy, he appears to see it as a personal betrayal. However, the vote on war powers was not the only major development taking place at the same time. Simultaneously, Trump declared a national emergency related to Venezuelan oil assets. On the surface, this move could be presented as a matter of energy security. A deeper examination, however, shows that the benefits are uncertain, likely far in the future, and would mostly advantage large multinational energy corporations rather than everyday American consumers. Declaring a national emergency is not always about the crisis itself. It is about the authority that comes with it. Emergency declarations allow presidents to bypass normal legislative processes, concentrate power in the executive branch, and redirect public attention. At this moment, there is significant scrutiny facing this administration, and there may be reasons to want to shift focus elsewhere. In addition to these issues, concerns are growing over stalled transparency initiatives. Documents that were promised, emphasized, and publicly prioritized have been released much more slowly than expected. Lawmakers such as Senator Sheldon Whitehouse have begun pointing out these delays, referencing timelines, legal requirements, and the gap between promises made and actions taken. Requests for Inspector General reviews are not accusations of wrongdoing. They are acknowledgments that something in the process is not operating as it should. Taken together, this is the current situation. Republicans are breaking with their president over war powers. Emergency declarations are being used in ways that raise serious concerns. Transparency commitments remain unfulfilled. And the White House is responding with escalation instead of explanation. To understand why this goes beyond daily headlines, it is necessary to examine how the system is supposed to work. The key reality about power in the United States is that the presidency is not permanent authority. It is a temporary role defined by law, limited by Congress, and accountable to the public. That is the theory. In practice, the system only works when people are willing to enforce those limits. For many years, particularly within the Republican Party, enforcement has been inconsistent. Many Republican lawmakers followed a pattern. They publicly supported the president, privately managed their concerns, and assumed that institutions would hold even if norms were pushed. That calculation is now falling apart. The reason is clear. When a president speaks openly about using military force against allied territory, something changes. This is no longer a disagreement over policy details such as taxes or immigration. It becomes a fundamental question about the purpose of American power and who has the authority to control it. Republican lawmakers are beginning to recognize that remaining silent would establish a dangerous precedent. A future president from either party could point to this moment and argue that Congress did not object before, so there is no reason to object later. That is how standards disappear, not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet acceptance that slowly becomes normal practice. The War Powers Act was created specifically for situations like this. It was passed after the Vietnam War, following years of military action carried out without proper congressional approval. Its purpose was to ensure that the decision to send Americans into combat would never belong to one individual alone. When Republicans voted to advance this resolution, they were not simply opposing Trump. They were defending a core constitutional principle that Congress has a legitimate and necessary role in decisions about war. To be clear, Trump has not ordered military action. He has not done so. The comments about Greenland remain rhetoric, but rhetoric still matters. Experienced lawmakers understand that once a president publicly frames military action as an option, the process begins. Military planning starts, assets are moved, and the opportunity for congressional intervention narrows quickly. That is why action was taken now. Waiting until troops are deployed would make intervention far more difficult. Trump's response, marked by anger, threats, and intimidation, reveals how he views power. He does not appear to see it as authority granted by law. He appears to view it as something personal. When Senator Collins voted according to her judgment, Trump did not treat it as a senator carrying out her constitutional duty. He treated it as disloyalty. This way of thinking, where power is personal, disagreement is betrayal, and oversight is seen as attack, has pushed some Republicans to a breaking point. They are weighing their records, their responsibilities to their states, and their constitutional oaths. They are asking themselves how they want to be remembered. Some are deciding that standing up at this moment matters more than going along. Not all of them, and not even most, but enough to have an impact. The emergency declaration fits directly into this pattern. When presidents feel constrained, they often turn to tools that avoid those constraints. Emergency powers allow that. Under a declared emergency, a president gains expanded authority, including the ability to redirect funds and act with less congressional oversight. When used properly, emergency powers serve an important purpose. Natural disasters, real security threats, and urgent situations sometimes require rapid action. However, these powers are also vulnerable to misuse. Declaring an emergency over Venezuelan oil assets at the same time that transparency concerns are growing naturally raises questions. Is this about protecting energy supplies? Or is it about changing the focus of public attention? Is it about national interest? Or about reinforcing authority when that authority feels challenged? No one can know Trump's internal motivations. However, patterns can be observed. A challenge emerges, escalation follows, and crisis language overshadows oversight. This has happened before, and it is happening again. Republicans recognize this pattern and are increasingly uneasy about where it leads. Much of the coverage focuses on the drama, the phone calls, the anger, and the spectacle. The more important story is structural. It concerns what happens when the leader of the system treats every limit as a personal insult. Constitutional government depends on friction. It is meant to move slowly, requiring compromise, negotiation, and cooperation. The founders designed it this way intentionally. They had just fought a war against a king and did not want to create another one. Power was divided across branches and institutions. For over 2 to 50 years, this system has functioned not because every president respected it voluntarily, but because enough people were willing to enforce its rules. What is happening now is a test of whether that enforcement still exists. Trump does not merely push against limits. He often denies their legitimacy. When he suggests that international law does not apply to him, treats treaties as optional, and presents his personal judgment as the only standard, he is promoting a view of presidential power that conflicts with constitutional government. Lawmakers are paying attention. They see the gap between what the president claims and what the law permits growing wider. Some have decided that the risk is now too great to ignore. The most concerning part is that this is not only about Trump. Regardless of personal opinions, he will not remain president forever. Another individual will eventually hold that office. That person will inherit every precedent set today, every unchecked power, every ignored norm, and every emergency declaration accepted without scrutiny. All of it becomes available to the next president. That is why Republicans are concerned not only about this administration, but about the future. If a Republican president can threaten military action against allies without strong resistance, what prevents a Democratic president from doing the same or more? Power itself does not belong to a party. They do not disappear on their own. Once these powers and precedents exist, they become extremely difficult to reverse. This reality is something the framers of the Constitution clearly understood. It is also what constitutional scholars have warned about for decades. And it is what is finally cutting through the partisan haze for some Republicans. The understanding that protecting an institution sometimes requires opposing the individual who temporarily controls it. That realization marks a shift. Now, it is important to focus on the transparency issue because it directly connects to everything else unfolding. One of the defining promises of this administration was transparency, releasing documents, exposing hidden information, and presenting openness as proof of integrity. That message resonated because it addressed a core concern for voters: trust. But when a promise like that is not fulfilled, consequences follow. When deadlines are missed, document releases are delayed, and strong rhetoric is not matched by real action, scrutiny increases. That is exactly what is happening now. Lawmakers are raising questions, not making accusations. Why have certain documents not been released? What caused the delays? Who made the decisions involved? And when a senator calls for an inspector general review, it is not an allegation of wrongdoing. It is an acknowledgement that something in the process failed and needs to be examined. This type of oversight is meant to be normal. It is how accountability works in a functioning system. However, for a president who views control as essential to survival, oversight feels dangerous. Oversight creates records. Records cannot be shaped by messaging. Records do not respond to threats. Records simply exist, quietly preserving what actually happened. That permanent documentation is exactly what Trump appears most eager to avoid. This leads directly back to emergency declarations and crisis-driven language. To understand this presidency, one principle is essential. When scrutiny increases, the narrative expands. Questions about transparency are met with emergency declarations over oil. Congressional resistance on war powers is followed by intensified rhetoric about national security threats. Internal party disagreement is reframed as betrayal by the establishment, followed by renewed loyalty tests. This is not accidental. It is a pattern, and it serves a purpose. That purpose is to keep attention moving so quickly that no single issue remains in focus long enough to force clear answers. But Congress is not supposed to function as an audience. It is a co-equal branch of government with constitutional authority to investigate, issue subpoenas, hold hearings, and demand records. Some members are beginning to act that way again. That is what makes this moment distinct. It is not the drama. There has been plenty of drama before. What is different is the activation of procedural mechanisms: war powers resolutions, oversight requests, inspector general reviews. These are not exciting tools. They are technical, slow, and often ignored by the public. But they are the core instruments of accountability, and they are being used now. To make this more concrete, it helps to move away from theory and into everyday reality. War powers, emergency declarations, and congressional procedures can sound distant, but their effects are personal. When a president can commit military force alone, it is ordinary Americans who are sent into harm's way. When emergency powers are misused, it is taxpayer money redirected without elected representatives having input. When transparency fails, it is the public's right to know how government operates that is weakened. This is not abstract. It affects the foundation of daily life. When trust in institutions declines, markets become unstable because policies are unpredictable. Businesses delay hiring and expansion because rules can change without warning. Allies reconsider cooperation because commitments no longer feel reliable. And ordinary people, families and workers, experience a country that feels less stable and less secure. That instability has measurable costs. Retirement savings may suffer when markets react to uncertainty. Military deployments may be extended due to inconsistent foreign policy. Small businesses may struggle as supply chains are disrupted by unpredictable decisions. These connections are not always obvious, but they are real. That is why constitutional limits matter far beyond government buildings. The rules governing presidential power exist to create stability, ensuring that no matter who holds office, personal impulses cannot override the system. When those limits are stretched or ignored, the effects ripple outward. Perhaps not immediately and not always in major headlines, but gradually through a growing sense of uncertainty that settles over a society losing confidence in its institutions. That is what is truly at stake. It is not only about which party wins elections. It is about whether the system remains capable of functioning, adapting, and correcting itself. At this moment, that question remains unanswered. So where does this lead? Caution is necessary here. Predicting outcomes with certainty is not realistic. Anyone who claims to know exactly what will happen is offering speculation. However, it is possible to outline likely paths. One possibility is that Republican resistance continues to grow. If more senators decide that limiting certain actions is worth the political risk, there could be additional legislative resistance, more war powers votes, expanded oversight, and increased public separation from the White House. This would not mean abandoning Trump entirely, but it would impose meaningful limits on executive action. A second possibility is that the resistance fades. Political pressure and primary challenges could bring hesitant lawmakers back into alignment, leaving this episode as a brief anomaly while precedents continue to build unchecked. A third possibility is that an external event changes everything. A major economic downturn, military conflict, or natural disaster could reset priorities entirely. These events are impossible to predict, but always possible. A fourth possibility is that legal and procedural processes advance slowly but steadily. Inspector General investigations conclude. Documents are eventually released. Oversight produces information that reshapes public understanding. This outcome may appear uneventful, but historically it can be the most influential because gradual accountability can generate lasting pressure. What matters most now is whether the Republicans who supported the War Powers Resolution maintain that position or quietly step back once attention fades. That choice will determine whether this moment reflects true institutional defense or temporary disruption. If one lesson stands out from history, it is that institutions can recover when enough individuals choose to defend them. But that defense requires consistency, not isolated acts. The coming months will show which direction this moment takes. If there is one thing to remember from this entire analysis, it is these 3 points. First, this opposition is coming from within the president's own party, and that represents a structural shift that did not exist 6 months ago. Second, emergency powers are increasingly used as political instruments rather than direct responses to clear crises. Third, the actions taken now will shape what future presidents can do. Every unchallenged power and ignored limit becomes precedent. Defending the system sometimes requires resisting the individual in charge of it, and that understanding is finally reaching some Republican lawmakers. Beyond this specific case, the larger issue remains unresolved. The country is still deciding what kind of nation it intends to be, one governed by laws that constrain power, or one where rules exist but bend under pressure? That question is answered not once, but repeatedly through decisions made by lawmakers, judges, voters, and citizens who choose whether to stay engaged. No one knows how this chapter ends, but understanding the stakes and the patterns is the first step toward meaningful participation. Democracy is not passive. It is a shared responsibility. Thank you for watching.